Okay, good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. If you're online here with us on Facebook Live, or this will be uploaded to YouTube here when we get done. We'll get kind of situated here. We're going to be in Romans chapter 11 for a few minutes this morning, and I'm glad that you've joined us. Glad that you're along with us for Sunday school today. Romans chapter 11, and the context, the full context is the entire chapter, kind of 1 through 29, but we're going to look at only parts of that this morning. Glad for you to be with us today. Again, I've enjoyed very much this study in the book of Romans. 4 sessions left the next 2 weeks in chapters 12 and 13. Chapter 12, that great verse that starts it, as living sacrifices, offer your bodies as offer them to God as living sacrifices, will come next week. Today, the title of the message is Mercy. Just a real simple, real basic title, Mercy. You have to remember, to kind of set the context for this, that the idea that God was now dealing with a different set of people besides just Jewish folks was a brand new concept, was a completely foreign idea to a lot of the hearers of these letters and the recipients of these letters, because God had never done that before. We're this morning in Acts chapter 7 during worship here in just a few minutes, and that's going to be that we're in that transitional phase, so to speak, where God is moving from just the Jews to now the Jews and the Gentiles. So this is, again, a newer concept. And as Romans is written, it is because of that. And so a lot of the times when Paul, even in his missionary journeys, would go to a new place, he would go to the synagogue. He would go to God's people first. Not explicitly, not only God's people, but he would go there first, and then it would kind of spread from there. So the idea was of being chosen ahead or first, last, that sort of thing. The lesson offered the introduction about, remember when you were a kid and you got picked for kickball or tag or whatever game that you played, and everybody wanted to be picked first, and you just didn't want to be picked last, which I don't mind telling you, I had a little experience in myself. And just that's the idea. Okay, if God likes these people or this group more or less than this other group, how do we kind of reconcile that, and how do we deal with those things? And so that's a lot of what our chapter 11 is about primarily. Just again, give you a little context. Verse 1 of chapter 11 says, "I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be, for I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew." And then he goes on and he makes that distinction, that we're not done with them, but we're just opening it to a new group. If we're allowing them to come in, it doesn't mean we get rid of the other folks. Just because we're giving the gospel to Gentiles now doesn't mean we're not giving it to the Jews anymore. And so that's part of the context of what we're talking about. So we're going to skip down, and verse 17 is where we're going to start our text lesson. If you're with Brumley and have your quarterly, we're on page 88 if you want to join me there. But we're in Romans chapter 11, verse 17. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them and became a partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree. Do not be arrogant toward the branches, but if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Quite right, he says. He says in verse 20, they were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. And so the first idea between this Jewish Gentile kind of the tension that's there is that Paul tells them to be humble. Don't look at each other as an us versus them mentality, or an us and then they're over there and we're over here, good, bad, kind of this dichotomy of people. It's not like that. It's not an either or an us them sort of thing. It's this idea that God has chosen us all together and brought us all into the family, whether we were naturally born, as in the Jewish heritage, or we were grafted in, as he talks about here. Someone who was grafted into the family was not naturally part of it, but God brought them in and now has joined them. And now from that point forward, they will forever be part of that family. Once you're grafted, you become part of that plan and you grow into it. And everything that happens after that, you grow as part of it. Paul had been teaching the Gentiles about the difficulty many Jews were having accepting Jesus as Messiah. And they had a lot of difficulty because they saw the law. They saw the Old Testament. Stephen, again, this strange how the lessons go together, but in the sermon this morning, Stephen is going to preach in Acts chapter 7, and he's going to preach the Old Testament, but he's going to preach Christ as the fulfillment of the Old Testament, and it makes those people that hear him so angry, they murder him. Like at the sermon, at the close of it, they rush him. It says they gnash their teeth, they rush him with one group, and they take him out, drive him out of the city, and stone him. So this is not just, well, I'm not sure about Jesus. Like they were actively opposed to it because of their heritage and their lineage and their history. And so Paul is writing here telling them, think about it as a tree. Okay, think about it as an olive tree. And he says in verse 17, you were grafted among them and have come to share the rich root. The root, according to Paul, is the Jewish faith. The idea that, the faith has just been for everyone. That's part of the concept there, is that Paul's lineage, even for himself, was that he was Jewish by nature. He had a Jewish background. That's who he was. That's who he had always been, was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He's going to talk about that in Galatians and other places that he writes. But now there was this concept, there was this idea that they were going to come together. There was going to be not Jew and Gentile anymore, but there was just going to be Christ who was Lord of all. And as they were going to be brought back together, there was going to be hostility. And so he tells them, be humble. Realize the root is Jewish, and now you as the branches are being grafted in, and now it's all the same plant. It's all the same tree. It's the same olive tree. We're all going to bear the same fruit. We're all going to grow the same way. The root came from the Jewish lineage and heritage, and now you, as a non-Jew, are being grafted into that, being made part of that. So you don't keep your own thing. I'm trying to think of it as like in a marriage. It's not the husband and the wife, and they have separate ideas and separate concepts. It's okay, now we have a brand new family, and it's both of us. Both of us are sharing what we have. It's not mine and yours. And true humility is how a marriage works. If you're gonna have a marriage, you got to have humility. Both people have to look at that and think of that concept. You have to work together. We have to remember, none of us have reason to boast. Our salvation, Jew or Gentile, is not dependent on us. It's dependent only on Jesus Christ. Like that's where salvation comes from. It is only through Christ that we get saved. It's only through Christ that we have the redemption of sins. It's only through Christ that through the shedding of blood, we have reconciliation to God. That is the only way any of those things take place or any of those things happen. And so we need to recall that and remember that as well, because that's a really important concept for us. So don't boast. Your salvation is dependent on Jesus. It's dependent on God's kindness. It's dependent on all of those sort of things. And so that's a very integral part of this, is that humility's got to be the forefront of what we're doing. Before we go on, look at the last verse of this section, last couple, 20 and then into 21. Do not be arrogant, he says, but beware, because if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. That ought to be a humbling statement for us. Again, the Old Testament is written in a Jewish context, a Jewish heritage. And when they rejected Christ, eventually the gospel went on to everyone else. If that's what he did to his chosen people, whom he's still not finished with, what would he do to us, those who are grafted in, those who've been invited in? We need to be cognizant of that and remember that now as God's children, he wants us there. He's invited us, and we need to act like it, and we need to live in such a way. The text, the quarterly text, mentions the word graft. Anyone who's worked with plants will be familiar with what grafting is. Literally just taking a branch and making it grow into part of another one, and then all of a sudden, instead of two separate, you have one that's come together. And that's what's happened with us through Christ, is we've been grafted in, and those things have taken place. So that's the first thing, is be humble. Second thing he says in our lesson is be thankful. Be thankful. Verses 22 through 24. Behold then the kindness and severity of God to those who fell. Severity, but to you, God's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, otherwise you will also be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? And so he goes on to help them now avoid a trap of being prideful. And he talks about God's balance between kindness and severity. And that's what verse 22 deals with. God is not just kind, that he overlooks evil, because that wouldn't really be kind either. But he's not so harsh that he condemns without cause. Instead, the text says he is both. He is kind and he is just, and treats sin severely. He must treat it severely. But that, by the way, is a part of kindness. If I don't treat wrongdoing with harshness, then I'm not really being kind. Because if I allow them to, quote unquote, get away with it, then I'm not being kind to those who have done what's right. So justice has those two components in it, of dealing with wrongdoing in order to be kind to those who have not done wrong, and vice versa. You have to have both of those parts in it. The Romans had experienced God's kindness. How? They'd been welcomed into his family. They were not part of God's family, and they had been grafted in. Again, they had been invited to become part of the family. When I got married, I was invited in to be part of another family. When God brought our kids to us, we invited them in to be part of our family. I've pastored 3 churches, and every time that I've gone to pastor a church, I've been invited to become part of the family of that church, God's family in that specific location. So we've all experienced this kindness as well from God's people, I would imagine, in one form or another. Paul challenges them, though, since they had been shown his kindness, to remain in this kindness. It does not mean that they could lose their salvation. Paul has already dealt with that in the last part of chapter 8, which I wish we could have studied. Again, I'm not to complain, but and chapter 11 is great. All of Romans is great. But if we had a limited study, I'm not entirely certain why we chose this passage instead of some others that I might have chosen. But I'm not the writer. So he's already dealt with that idea in the letter. They can't lose their salvation. That's not what he's saying here. He is simply, reminding them to stay true to who they were, to live like what they claimed to be. And that's a reminder that all of us need, consistently and constantly. We need to be reminded of who we are and whose we are, and how to live like that and how to act that way. Because it's not just an act. It is something that happens within us that then flows out of us. It's not just an outward action. It's something that becomes a heart issue that then we live out based on what's already happened to our heart. This was not theoretical. This was not just a concept or an idea. This was Paul's testimony. Paul had been this before, right? He had been, at his heart, totally anti-Christ, anti-Christian, persecuting those who had become believers because he was so devout to the old faith, the old way. And so he had done that before. He had been outside that, and in spite of what he had done, God continued to show him kindness and allow him to be grafted back in, to be pulled back in. God had grafted Paul in as a former Jewish person. So look at the passage again. He says that they had, verse 24, if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back in? Paul was kind of saying, I was part of the original tree. I rejected it when Christ came as the root of that tree, but then I got grafted back into it. It was his initial home. He was out of it for rejection of the faith of Christ, but then he was pulled back into it, and it belonged to him, in the first place, so to speak. Because it is a Jewish tree, it is a Jewish faith that we are studying about and learning about. And so that's basically what he says in these verses. Paul had the opportunity to be pulled back and brought back into something that he had kind of already been a part of. God has the ability to do anything that he wants to do. He is sovereign. And so we're not going to understand all of the things that God does. And my position on that is I'm okay with that. I'm okay with not understanding everything that God does or the why that he does everything, because it's not for me to understand. It's not for me to fully grasp and fully comprehend. There is an element of faith in some of those things. Not a blind faith. I think we have a lot of evidence for our faith to follow and to go along, and we have continuous proof of God's daily faithfulness to us. So it's not that sort of thing, but it is the idea that we do need to realize how big he is and how awesome and high and lofty and holy God is. And he is sovereign. And so just because he does something that doesn't make sense to me doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. It is just in my short-sightedness. And so God can graft in anyone as part of this tree that he wants to. He can bring anyone into the faith. That is God's deal. And God has the ability to do that. And so I have to recognize that and be at peace with that, knowing that he knows best. The sovereignty of God makes an excellent pillow. It's a great place to lay down your worries and your cares and your burdens and just realize he's going to take care of them, whatever those needs may be and however those needs may show up in your own life. God takes care of all those in his time and in his way. And so the lesson from these three verses here in 22 through 24 is to be thankful. Just to be thankful that we're part of it, that he has brought us in, that he's made us part of his lineage and his heritage, and for us just to be hopeful in who he is and for what he has done. It's just an overflowing of thankfulness ought to be our default position. No matter what we're getting from God at any particular time, we should be very, very thankful for it because he's good. He is a good father to us all the time. Here's the third section. It's rather long. It's 25 through 32. Paul says there, I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel under the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so Israel will be saved, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. From the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of your fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you were once disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience, so these also now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they may now be shown mercy. For God has shut up all in disobedience, so that he may show mercy to all. Lot there, okay? Lot here. Be aware. Paul uses this phrase here in verse 25. Don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery. Paul uses this phrase multiple times. He talks about the rapture at one point with it. He talks about those who have fallen asleep. He doesn't want you to be ignorant of those things. And so this is a continual phrase that he uses in his writings pretty often. So it's something we can be familiar with. Paul quotes from the Old Testament here a couple times, from Isaiah chapter 59 and Jeremiah chapter 31. And he is just basically making a case that he has always been active and he has always been doing something, even when it didn't seem from an outward perspective that he was. Meaning he's always been in the hearts of Israel and in the hearts of the Gentiles. He's always been doing these things. He's always been moving people and nations and kings and armies and all those things. Our gifts, our calling is, it can't be revoked, can't be taken away. This is not just a recent thing that he said, okay, well, since I didn't do this, now I'll do this. No, this is something that Paul has always been doing, or that God has always been doing, that Paul is making them aware of. No matter how much rebellion or how much hard hearts or any of those things that he talks about, that doesn't change God's plan, because he's sovereign and he knows what he's doing. It says he knows the end from the beginning. This is always who God is and always what God is doing, to always be fully aware of the position of every person around. I think this part of the lesson might help some of us in the current circumstances, just to be reminded of God's sovereignty. that he is above and beyond and before all things. And nothing happens outside of his divine will, outside of his hand of permissiveness in some cases. Sometimes he allows us to be rebellious, and it's for our own ruin. Many times we make wrong choices, but God allows some of those things. We have to come to that place where we realize that God, through decree and through, again, permissiveness, sometimes all things take place. Nothing happens outside of God's purview, outside of God's sovereignty. And so that's what these verses are, just kind of again, if you think of Romans as a long court case, Paul is making different arguments. And in this section, he's making an argument that God is sovereign and active, and he has always been dealing with the Jews and the Gentiles and everybody involved. And so none of us have the right to say, well, God loves me more than you, or loves them more. All that goes away. We're all at the same place when it comes to Jesus. And that's where chapter 12, verse 1 says, okay, give yourself as a living sacrifice. Why? Because God has always been at work with you. God has always been doing these things with you. And so don't think that he just started this idea or just kind of came up with this concept. Verse 32, God has consigned all to disobedience that he may have mercy on all. Again, whether Jewish or Gentile, when we disobey, God has the opportunity to show us mercy. Here's the bottom line. None of us are good enough on our own. We all have to be grafted into this tree that he's speaking about, this metaphor that Paul used in this chapter. We all have to be brought into the family of God. We have to be forgiven to be brought into the family of God. And so what boasting is there? There's none, because grace brought all of us in. Mercy brought all of us here. That adoption brought all of us into the family of God. And God has given Jesus so that we may all see salvation, because there's none of us righteous, no, not one. And so a lot of what this section deals with is this idea of, hey, just a reminder, God's active. God is doing things. Be humble. Be aware that God is doing things. Have humility toward who you are. Be thankful that God has brought you in. All these three basic ideas are all saying kind of the same thing. That just we need to be reminded that God is active, he's living, and he is entrenched in everything that goes on around us. Every minute detail, God is the God of all of those things. And so we need to be aware of that. And again, not in the book of Romans, not my favorite passage, but it was the next one in the textbook. And so we dealt with it today. Again, I might have chosen something different, but I'm not the author of the Sunday school text. So anyway, just wanted to share that with you this morning. We're going to take a little bit of a break here. It is right now 9:30. And so here at about 10 o'clock, we're going to log back on, and we will be live on Facebook and YouTube with our morning service. Going to have some good worship this morning, and then be in the book of Acts, the 7th chapter. And so I hope that you can join us for that here in just a few minutes. So take a little break and get you another cup of coffee if you want to this morning, and join us back here in a few minutes for our morning worship. Have a good and godly Sunday.